What if the greatest promise Jesus makes in the entire liturgical year has passed right in front of you, more than once, and no one ever sat down with you to explain exactly what it contains, who it belongs to, and what has to happen inside your soul for it to be fulfilled? Divine Mercy. Sunday is not simply another day of devotion. It is the day Jesus said something he said on no other day of the year, something specific, something that has your name on it. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who understood the mercy of God, not because she had studied it, but because she had received it all the way to the bottom of her soul, left behind something she wrote about that gift that completely changes the way we approach that Sunday. Because there is a world of difference between knowing a promise exists and truly understanding what it contains when it becomes active, and whether your soul is in a condition to receive it. Millions of devoted Catholics celebrate that Sunday every year. They go to Mass, they pray, they go to confession, and yet something never quite lands. Something stays at the threshold. What is it that separates the soul that receives the promise from the soul that brushes up against it without it ever taking hold? Saint Teresa of Jesus saw this in prayer with a clarity that theology alone cannot reach. If you have ever felt that God's mercy is for everyone except you, write right now in the comments, "Lord, I trust in your mercy." Write it because you need to say it, because your soul needs to speak those words before this Sunday arrives. What is coming is not information about mercy. It is mercy itself explained from the inside, from someone who lived it, who received it when she needed it most. Listen to everything. Each part depends on the one before it. There are words the Church speaks with a solemnity we don't always fully grasp. Words we have been hearing since childhood, words that have become part of the landscape of our faith, the way the walls of the house we grew up in became part of the landscape of our lives. So constant, so ever-present, that we sometimes stop seeing them with the attention they deserve. Divine Mercy is one of those words. We say it at Mass, we pray it in the chaplet, we call upon it when someone dies and when someone is born, when a child drifts away and when illness arrives without warning. But there is one moment in the year when that word stops being merely a word and becomes an active promise, concrete, precise in its conditions, and guaranteed in its fulfillment by the full authority of the Church. That moment is Divine Mercy Sunday. And to understand what Jesus promised to accomplish on that day, we first need to understand where that promise comes from, what it truly contains, and why the Church considers it unlike any other grace the liturgical year offers. It all begins with the Paschal mystery, not with an isolated apparition, not with a private devotion that arose in some convent, not with a form of personal spirituality the Church evaluated and eventually approved. It begins with the resurrection itself, with the very heart of the Christian mystery, the event that splits history in two and upon which everything else depends. When Jesus rises from the dead, the first thing he does when he appears to his disciples is not to prove he is alive. The first thing he does is give them peace. He breathes on them and says, "Receive the Holy Spirit, whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven." The first word of the risen Lord is mercy. The first act of the risen Lord is forgiveness. This is not a minor detail tucked into the Easter narrative. It is the very heart of what the resurrection means for the human soul. Christ does not rise to display his power. Christ rises to open a door that sin had shut. And the very first thing he does upon stepping back through that door into life is offer forgiveness to the ones who had abandoned him the night before. The octave of Easter is the liturgical extension of that founding moment. The Church does not close Easter in a single day because she knows that a mystery of such magnitude needs time to be received, absorbed, understood from the inside. For 8 days, the liturgical calendar remains suspended in the joy of the resurrection as as though heaven itself is reluctant for that moment of encounter between God and humanity to end too quickly. And the last of those 8 days, the one that closes the octave and seals what Easter came to bring, gathers into itself the full merciful force of the Paschal mystery. It is the day the Church presents to the world the most accessible, the most humanly comprehensible face of the mystery of the resurrection, the mercy of God, poured out without restriction upon every soul that trusts in it. What that day contains in terms of grace is something the Church describes with a precision worth pausing to take in. The plenary indulgence attached to Divine Mercy Sunday is not simply a reduction of temporal punishment. It is not an abbreviated form of penitential satisfaction. It is not merely one spiritual benefit among the many the liturgical year offers. It is the complete remission of all the punishment still owed for sins already forgiven in confession. This means that a soul which on that Sunday fulfills the required conditions, sacramental confession, Eucharistic communion, prayer for the Holy Father's intentions, and freedom from all attachment to sin, receives something that in spiritual terms is equivalent to starting over. Not with the past erased as though it never happened, not with the memory wiped clean, but with the debt fully paid. With the soul in the same state it was on the day of baptism, when there was nothing between it and God that needed to be repaired, when the distance between the soul and heaven was precisely zero. This is what Jesus promised to fulfill on that day. Not a feeling of peace, not an emotional experience of forgiveness that warms the chest and fades by midweek. A real, objective, sacramental reality, guaranteed by the authority of the Church, that acts upon the soul independently of what the soul happens to feel in that particular moment. And this is where the first crack appears in the understanding of many devoted Catholics who have been celebrating that Sunday with sincerity and faith for years, because there is an enormous difference between a grace that is felt and a grace that is received. There are souls who on that Sunday experience deep emotion, genuine devotion, a warmth inside that they take as a sign something happened. And yet they do not receive the indulgence because they did not fulfill the conditions the Church requires. And there are souls who on that Sunday feel nothing extraordinary, no surge of emotion, no visible sign that heaven has moved, and who receive the full grace because their interior disposition is exactly what God asks for. What is that disposition? What has to take place inside the soul for the promise of Jesus to find somewhere to land, to take root, to be fulfilled in its full force? That question has an answer. One Saint Teresa of Jesus did not formulate in canonical language, but in the language of lived experience, of a soul that has been in that exact place and emerged from it completely transformed. An answer her Carmelite sisters knew and applied, and that she herself left written with an honesty rarely found in the spiritual literature of any century. But to understand what Teresa saw, we first need to understand from what vantage point she saw it, and what she had been required to pass through in her own soul before God entrusted her with that vision. Saint Teresa of Jesus did not arrive at the mercy of God by way of steady virtue. She arrived by way of falling, rising, falling again, and rising again. Over years, she herself described as the most painful and most humbling of her interior life. There is something in that journey that cannot be glossed over when reading her words about divine forgiveness, because those words do not come from someone who spoke of mercy from theory or from admiring it at a safe distance. They come from someone who needed it desperately, who asked for it when she didn't feel she had any right to ask, who received it when she was convinced it was far too late to receive anything at all. And that gives her words a weight that no theological formulation, however precise, can match. In the book of her life, Saint Teresa of Jesus does something that few women of her era did easily. She describes herself with a candor that is at times almost uncomfortable to read. She speaks of the years when she lived divided between prayer and the world, between the longing for God and the attachments to relationships and comforts that pulled her away from that longing. She talks about how she abandoned mental prayer for a period because it seemed to her like hypocrisy to draw near to God while continuing to choose what she knew God did not want for her. And she speaks of how that decision, made with reasoning that appeared on the surface to be humble, was in fact the gravest mistake of her spiritual life. Stepping away from prayer because she felt unworthy was not an act of humility. It was, in her own words, the moment the enemy convinced her that distance was the most fitting response, when in truth, distance was the very thing doing her the most harm. What Teresa discovered in that period, and what she left written so that none of her Carmelite daughters would make the same mistake, is something that illuminates the promise of Divine Mercy Sunday with a clarity that has no equal in the spiritual literature of her time. She discovered that God does not measure the way we measure, that the human logic which says, "First I'll deserve it, then I'll ask," is a logic divine love simply does not recognize, does not apply, does not even acknowledge. God does not wait for the soul to be clean before drawing near to it. God draws near to the soul precisely when it is at its most soiled, precisely when the soul can barely lift its eyes, precisely at the moment when shame makes stepping away seem like the only dignified option. This is the understanding Teresa reached about mercy, and it turns her writings into a key for understanding the promise of Divine Mercy Sunday in a way that goes far beyond checking off external requirements. Because the problem Teresa diagnoses in the soul that fails to receive mercy is not a problem of unconfessed sin. It is not a problem of prayers left unprayed. It is not a problem of liturgical conditions left unfulfilled. It is a problem of the image of God. It is the problem of believing in one's deepest heart that God is a judge who keeps a running tally, and that at some point the tally closes because too many negative entries have accumulated. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the book of her life that her greatest mistake was not the sins she had committed, but the smallness of her trust in the greatness of God. That while she was calculating whether she deserved to draw near, God was waiting for her with a patience that had no bottom and a love that did not diminish with each fall, but that somehow, in a way reason cannot explain, only intensified in the face of weakness. This revelation did not come to Teresa all at once. It arrived slowly, over years of prayer, of reading, of conversations with confessors, of interior experiences she documented with the precision of someone who knows that what she is living does not belong to her alone. And what Teresa saw in that slow unfolding of revelation about the mercy of God is exactly what the Church places at the center of Divine Mercy Sunday. That there is a moment when God opens the floodgates of His love with a generosity that surpasses anything the human mind can anticipate, and that the only condition God places on that generosity, reaching all the way to the bottom of the soul, is a single one that has nothing to do with the number of prayers said or the years of virtuous living accumulated, a condition that Saint Teresa of Jesus identified as the most difficult for the soul that has been carrying the weight of its own history for a long time. A condition that is not penance, not fasting, not any external practice. It is something that happens inside the soul when it decides, in an act that costs more than any physical sacrifice, to let go of the weight of its own distrust and allow itself to fall into the arms of a God who has been waiting since before it was born. What exactly is that condition? Why did Teresa consider it the most difficult, the most resisted, the one the devout soul sidesteps most often precisely because it is devout? The answer lies at the very heart of the interior castle, in the place where Teresa describes in greatest detail what happens in the soul when God and human distrust come face to face. And what Teresa found in that encounter changes completely the way we approach Divine Mercy Sunday. Trust, that is the condition. Not devotion, though devotion helps. not the number of prayers said in the days leading up to that Sunday, though praying is good and necessary. Not the years of consecrated life, the intensity of sorrow over sins committed, the thoroughness of the examination of conscience done in the days before. The condition Jesus places on his promise being fulfilled in the soul with its full force. The condition Saint Teresa of Jesus identified with a clarity few spiritual writers of her era reached is trust. A trust that is not a feeling, that does not depend on the mood of the day, that does not shift according to whether the week went well or badly. A trust that is a decision of the soul, made from within, that says, God is greater than everything I have done, and I choose to believe that even when I cannot feel it right now. Saint Teresa of Jesus spends page after page in the interior castle, describing the soul that prays, that strives, that fulfills its spiritual obligations, and yet makes no progress in the interior life. And the diagnosis Teresa offers for that situation does not point to a lack of good works or lukewarmness in devotional practice. It points to something far more subtle and far more damaging, a distrust of oneself carried to an extreme that appears on the surface to be humility, but is in reality a disguised form of resistance to grace. The soul that constantly tells itself it is not worthy, that its sins are too many, that God could not possibly want anything truly great from someone with its track record. That soul is not being humble. It is placing its own measurements above the measurements of God. It is telling God, in effect, that His mercy has a limit it already knows, and that limit is itself. Teresa saw this in herself before she saw it in anyone else. She recognized in her own story the years when distrust kept her paralyzed on the threshold of a grace that was waiting for her on the other side, a grace she never crossed into because she remained convinced that crossing was too much for someone like her. And what finally brought her across that threshold was not an additional effort. It was not a longer penance or a more perfect prayer. It was an act of surrender, a moment in which the soul decides to stop arguing with God about its own merits and simply trust that the love God offers is exactly as great as God says it is. This is why Saint Teresa of Jesus insists throughout the interior castle that the interior journey is not a journey of conquest, but of surrender. It is not the soul advancing toward God on the strength of accumulated virtues. It is the soul allowing itself to be carried by God once it finally stops resisting. And the most tenacious resistance, the hardest to recognize because it wraps itself in spiritual language and the appearance of humility, it's the resistance to believing that God can truly want the soul as it is, not as it will be when it improves, not as it was before the fall, as it is right now, in this precise moment with its entire history in tow. In the context of Divine Mercy Sunday, this has a concrete implication that very few people pause to consider. There are souls who on that Sunday approach confession and communion with a constricted heart, carefully measuring their words in the confessional, wondering if what they said was enough, second-guessing whether the priest fully understood the gravity of what they confessed, doubting after receiving communion whether they were properly disposed, whether the grace actually arrived. And in that spiral of doubts and self-checks, in that constant examination of whether they deserve what God is offering, they lose precisely what they came to find. Not because they failed to fulfill the external conditions, but because the interior condition, the only one God places as truly indispensable, was never met. The trust was not there. The soul arrived on Divine Mercy Sunday with all its devotion and without the one thing God needed to find in it. And here is the deepest tension in all of this teaching. Because that devout soul that arrives without trust does not arrive without trust out of ill will. It arrives without trust precisely because it takes its relationship with God seriously, because it knows its sins better than anyone, because it has lived long enough to know what it has chosen when it could have chosen differently. The distrust in that soul is not indifference. It is the paradoxical result of a sensitive conscience that has turned the knowledge of its own wretchedness into an obstacle greater than the wretchedness itself. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who walked down that same dark corridor for years, knew exactly what is needed to come out the other side. She knew what the soul must do when distrust has it frozen at the threshold of Divine Mercy Sunday, looking from the outside at a grace that bears its name but cannot seem to cross over. The answer Teresa gives is not pious advice. It is an instruction born of experience. And when the Church reads it today in the light of the promise of that Sunday, something falls into place with a precision that makes it impossible to go on, believing that trust is optional, that it is a devout complement to the real conditions, an ornament added by the soul that has already done what it needed to do. Trust is not the ornament. Trust is the door. Tweedy, then there is a passage in the book of her life that Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote at a time when she still did not know with certainty whether her interior experiences came from God or from the enemy's deception. At a time when her confessors had doubts, when the people around her watched her with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, and when she herself lived with the constant tension of being unable to verify from the outside what she felt from the inside. It is a passage that was not written to be published. It was written at the instruction of her confessors, who wanted to understand what was happening in the interior of a woman who described experiences none of them had ever had. And in that context of obedience and vulnerability, Teresa wrote something about the mercy of God that has been preserved for centuries as one of the most direct, most human testimonies any soul has ever left about the experience of divine forgiveness. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in the book of her life that she never stopped trusting in the mercy of God, not even in the worst moments of her interior life, not even when everything else was failing. That while virtue wavered, while constancy in prayer broke down, while self-love pulled her away from what she knew to be true, there was something in her that never quite gave way, the conviction that God was greater than her sin. She did not always feel it. She could not always articulate it clearly. But deep inside her soul, there was a certainty the enemy attacked relentlessly without ever fully extinguishing it, that the mercy of God did not have the bottom she assigned to it when she measured herself from within her own wretchedness. And it was in that space of fragile but persistent conviction that God acted, not when Teresa was at her spiritual best, not when she had finished putting her life in order and become the reformer history knows her to be. Much earlier than that, at the moment when she was still a divided soul, still bound to habits she herself recognized as incompatible with the intimacy with God she longed for. God did not wait for the finished Teresa before beginning to work in her. God began with the broken Teresa, the ashamed Teresa, the Teresa who sat down to pray, knowing she had made poor choices in the hours before. And what God did in that broken Teresa is exactly what He promises to do on Divine Mercy Sunday for every soul that trusts in Him without conditions. This closes a question many Catholics have been carrying in silence for years, rarely daring to voice it aloud. Can a person who has sinned gravely, who carries a long, specific history of distance from God, who arrives on that Sunday, not with years of virtuous living, but with years of falls more or less acknowledged, can that person receive the full promise? Or is the promise for those who were already close, who only needed a final push toward the fullness of a grace they were nearly there? To receive? The answer Saint Teresa of Jesus gives, read from the book of her life and from the experience she documented herself, is unambiguous. The promise is not for those who barely need it. The promise is precisely for those who need it most, for the soul that arrives carrying a heavy load, for the soul that brings more history than merit, for the soul that has prayed on Divine Mercy Sunday for years without quite daring to believe that what Jesus promised on that day could truly apply to someone with its particular weight. That soul is exactly the primary recipient of the promise, not because God rewards unfaithfulness, but because mercy, by definition, is not a reward. It is a gift, and gifts are not earned, they are received. And to receive them, only one thing is needed: open your hands. Saint Teresa of Jesus understood the human soul with a depth rarely concentrated in a single person. She knew the tendency of the devout soul to believe that the size of the gift is tied to the size of the merit. She knew the temptation to think that God calibrates His mercy according to the recipient's track record, giving more to those who have done more and less to those who have failed more. And she devoted page after page of her writings to dismantling that logic with the patience of someone who knows it is the most stubborn obstacle standing between the soul and the grace God wants to give it. Because what Jesus promises to fulfill on Divine Mercy Sunday is not proportional. It is not calculated according to the history of the recipient. It is staggering, excessive by human standards, generous to a degree that reason cannot process without surrendering. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who received that generosity when she deserved it least and needed it most, spent the rest of her life trying to convince the souls around her that what God offers does not have the ceiling they have placed on it, that the promise Jesus fulfills on that Sunday is real, it is complete, it is for them, that the only question worth asking when that day arrives is not whether one deserves it, but whether one trusts. When the promise of Jesus is fulfilled in the soul, there are not always visible signs, not always tears, not always a peace that floods down all at once like cool water on a feverish brow, not always an inner clarity that makes it obvious something has changed. Sometimes the greatest grace a soul receives in its entire life arrives in silence, without announcement, without the emotional charge the soul expected as confirmation that something real had taken place. And the absence of that emotion becomes, for many devout souls, the reason to doubt, to go back over what happened, to run through the conditions again and search for the mistake that would explain why they don't feel what they expected to feel. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew that silence. She lived it in her own body and soul during periods she described as times of great interior aridity, moments when prayer produced no sensible consolation, when the soul operated on pure faith without any support from the senses or the imagination. And what Teresa learned in those periods, and what she left written with a precision that is enormously consoling for the soul passing through something similar, is that the absence of sensible experience is not a sign of the absence of grace. It is, more often than not, a sign of the opposite. In the 4th dwelling places of the interior castle, Saint Teresa of Jesus describes 2 types of interior experience the soul can have in prayer: what she calls consolations and what she calls spiritual delights. Consolations begin within the soul itself. They arise from the soul's own effort to meditate, to pray, to prepare itself interiorly, and they produce a satisfaction that moves upward from the interior, outward to the senses. Spiritual delights are something entirely different. They begin not in the soul, but in God. They are not sought, but received. They do not depend on what the soul is doing at that moment, but on what God chooses to give. And the detail Teresa adds, the one that changes everything, is that spiritual delights do not always make themselves felt in the same way as consolations. Sometimes they arrive so gently, so deeply, at a level so far below the surface of the senses that the soul does not register them as an emotional experience at all, only as a quiet, settled peace, one that is simply there, without the soul quite knowing where it came from or when it arrived. This has a direct application to the experience of Divine Mercy Sunday, when the soul fulfills the conditions and receives the plenary indulgence, when the promise of Jesus is fulfilled in it, what takes place in the spiritual order is real and entirely independent of what the soul feels in that moment. The grace is not conditioned by sensible experience. The debt is paid even if the soul does not feel it. The soul is clean even if it does not experience the emotional relief that sometimes accompanies absolution. And the temptation to doubt, to go back over what happened, to search in feelings for the confirmation that only faith can provide, is exactly the temptation Saint Teresa of Jesus identified as the main obstacle to growing in the interior life after receiving a great grace. Teresa described in the book of her life her own experiences of grace received in silence, without outward sign, without sensible consolation. Moments when the Lord acted in her soul in a way she did not discover until days or even weeks later, when she suddenly noticed that something had changed without being able to identify exactly when or how. And what Teresa drew from those experiences was not confusion, but a certainty she later passed on to her daughters with all the authority of someone who has lived it firsthand. God's grace does not need your permission to act. It does not need you to verify it in order to be real. It is not stopped by your distrust, though distrust can reduce the soul's readiness to receive it in its fullness. There is something more Teresa adds about this silence of grace that is especially relevant in the context of Divine Mercy Sunday. She says that the soul which receives a great grace and does not feel, it has before it an opportunity that the soul which feels it with great emotion does not always have. The opportunity to believe without sensible support, to trust without external confirmation, to act as though the promise is real, even when nothing in the moment seems to back it up. And that, Teresa says, is faith in its purest form. The cleanest act of faith the soul can make, not believing because it felt something, but believing because God promised. And that act of faith, made in the silence of an unfelt grace, has a spiritual value Saint Teresa of Jesus considered among the highest the soul can offer to God in this life. But there are obstacles that are not the silence of the interior or the absence of sensible experience. There are obstacles the soul actively builds, without knowing it is building them, precisely because it is being devout. Saint Teresa of Jesus knew them well. She had seen them in herself, observed them in her sisters in the convent, encountered them in the souls who wrote to her or came to speak with her seeking guidance. And in the way of perfection, she described them with a candor that at moments is almost startling, because she is speaking of obstacles that arise not from sin, but from virtue misunderstood, not from indifference toward God, but from an excess of attention to one's own spiritual state that ends up placing the self at the center of the space where God should be. The first of these obstacles is scrupulosity, not the healthy kind, the sensitivity of conscience that makes the soul attentive to sin and genuinely eager not to offend God, but disordered scrupulosity, the kind that turns every act into an unanswerable question, that has the soul leaving confession, wondering whether it confessed well, whether the priest understood, whether something was forgotten, whether contrition was deep enough, whether the conditions for the indulgence were met in exactly the right way. That scrupulosity does not arise from love of God. It arises from fear, and fear, when it occupies the place that trust should hold, does not purify the soul. It binds it. It keeps the soul circling around itself in a motion that looks spiritual, but is in reality a sophisticated way of never quite reaching God, because the soul spinning in its own doubts is not looking at God but at itself. Saint Teresa of Jesus was blunt on this point in the way of perfection. She said that the scrupulous soul, far from being a soul especially sensitive to sin, is often a soul that has placed its own evaluation above the mercy of God, that it has decided in practice that God's judgment about its condition is not sufficient, and that its own assessment is needed to confirm what God has already done. And this, though it sounds like humility, is precisely the opposite. It is a form of spiritual pride disguised as a tender conscience, and it ends up preventing the soul from receiving what it came for. The second obstacle Teresa identifies is self-sufficiency dressed up as preparation. This is the soul that arrives on Divine Mercy Sunday, convinced that the grace it receives will be proportional to the preparation it put in during the week before. That if it prayed the novena completely, if it went to confession on Saturday morning, if it attended daily Mass all week, if it read appropriate spiritual texts, then it has earned the right to expect a greater, more complete, more definitive grace. This soul is not badly intentioned, it is sincerely devout. But it has confused preparation, which is good and recommended, with a merit that determines the scale of what God can give. And in that confusion, it has once again placed its own measurements above the measurements of God. The third obstacle is the hardest to recognize, precisely because it presents itself with the most spiritual appearance of all: lukewarmness disguised as realism. This is the soul that has arrived at a kind of peace with its own spiritual mediocrity. It no longer expects great things from its relationship with God, not out of indifference, but because it has learned not to get its hopes up, so as not to be disappointed. It arrives on Divine Mercy Sunday with a proper devotion, but without any real expectation that on this day something is actually going to change in its interior life. Saint Teresa of Jesus considered this state one of the most dangerous on the spiritual path. More dangerous even than open sin, because open sin at least keeps alive in the soul the awareness that something is wrong and something needs to change. This settled lukewarmness does not. It has made its peace with the distance and stopped feeling it as distance. In her own words, Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote in The Way of Perfection that nothing caused her more grief when she looked at souls than watching how they had grown accustomed to asking little of God, as though God had reasons to give little, that the soul which approaches God with small expectations is not being humble. It is being unjust to a God whose generosity has no ceiling and whose capacity to give far exceeds any human capacity to imagine what can be received. And the antidote to that injustice is not to force emotion or manufacture artificial expectations. It is to do one thing: truly believe the promise. Believe that what Jesus said he would do on that Sunday, he does, completely, without restriction, in the soul that trusts in him without conditions. So the question that everything above makes inevitable: what did Saint Teresa of Jesus actually do on that Sunday? Not in general terms, not as an abstract spiritual principle, but concretely. How did she prepare her soul? What attitude did she bring when she drew near to moments of extraordinary grace? What did she do with her history, with its weight, with everything she knew about herself that was unworthy of what she was about to receive? Because Teresa was no innocent. She knew her sins with a precision she herself documented. She knew exactly where she had failed, for how long, and with what consequences for her interior life. And yet, she drew near. She asked. She received. What was happening in her interior that allowed her to do that without the shame of her history slamming the door? The answer is spread throughout all her writings, but comes together most clearly in the interior castle, in the place where Teresa describes the difference between the soul that knows its own wretchedness and stops there, and the soul that knows its wretchedness and uses it as a launching point towards something greater. Teresa did not ask her Carmelite sisters to ignore their history or to arrive at moments of grace as though their past had never happened. She asked exactly the opposite. She asked them to bring everything, to arrive carrying the full weight of who they were, to leave nothing at the door, because what is left at the door is precisely what God wants to transform on the inside. The practice Saint Teresa of Jesus followed before moments of great grace was not one of accumulation, but of emptying. She did not add things, she removed things. In the days before a grace she sensed approaching, Teresa did not multiply her vocal prayers or increase her penances or seek new devotional practices to give herself the feeling that she had done enough. What she did was reduce the interior noise. She silenced the voices that calculated, evaluated, measured. She created in her interior the space that grace needs in order to enter without meeting resistance. And that space is not created by praying more. It is created by trusting more, by releasing your own assessments and placing in the Lord's hands the decision about what the soul deserves and what it is capable of receiving. There is a detail in the book of her life that illustrates this with an image not easily forgotten. Teresa describes a moment of prayer in which the Lord showed her her own soul as a mirror that reflected the presence of Christ within it, with a clarity proportional to how clean the mirror was. And what Teresa understood from that image, what she left written as an instruction for her daughters, is that the soul's task is not to generate the presence of Christ, but to clean the mirror so that the presence, which is already there, can reflect without distortion. Trust is what cleans the mirror. Distrust, scrupulosity, constant self-evaluation, these are what cloud it. Applied to Divine Mercy Sunday, this means something very concrete. The soul that arrives on that Sunday, preoccupied with whether it did enough, whether it fulfilled the conditions properly, whether its contrition was adequate, is clouding the mirror at the very moment it most needs it clean. Not because the conditions don't matter, but because the obsession with the conditions is itself a form of distrust that places one's own actions at the center instead of the mercy of God. And when one's own actions occupy the center, the mercy of God gets pushed toward the margins. What Saint Teresa of Jesus did on that Sunday, and in all the moments of great grace her contemplative life offered her, was one single thing, described in different words throughout her writings. She surrendered. She surrendered not as defeat, but as self-offering. She placed in God's hands the evaluation of what her soul deserved, and she stepped back from that process with the trust that God evaluates better than anyone, and that His evaluation always concludes in mercy for the soul that comes to Him. She surrendered to the love. She surrendered to the promise. She believed that what Jesus said He would do on that Sunday, He truly does, without verifying it, without calculating it, without waiting for the sensible confirmation that would prove something had happened. And there is one more thing Teresa added to that surrender, something found in the way of perfection that completes the picture of what it means to approach Divine Mercy Sunday with the disposition God asks for. She said that the soul which comes to the Lord with empty hands, empty of merits but full of trust, is the soul that most gladdens His heart. That God does not need us to arrive with something to show. He simply needs us to arrive. That the act of coming, precisely when we feel least entitled to come, is in itself the purest act of faith and the most welcome. And that in that act of coming without merit but with trust, something is accomplished in the soul that no amount of accumulated merit could ever produce. The moment has come to close what has been open since the beginning. The moment has come to answer the question that started all of this. What exactly does Jesus fulfill on Divine Mercy? Sunday, how does He fulfill it, and what happens in the soul when He does? The promise is not a mechanism. It is not a spiritual operation that activates automatically once the external conditions are met, as if you dropped a coin into a machine and waited for the result. The promise is an act of love, a free, gratuitous act, extravagant in its generosity, that God performs in the soul that trusts, because that is the nature of divine love, to give without measure, to give without requiring merit, to give precisely where it is most needed and least expected. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who received that love in the moments she deserved it least and needed it most, spent the rest of her life trying to put into words what happens in the soul when that love arrives without obstacle. What happens, according to Teresa, is not always felt immediately. We have already seen that. But there is something that does take place in the objective order, in the order of spiritual reality that exists independently of what the soul perceives. The soul is set free, free from the debt sin creates, free from the punishment that debt carries, free with a freedom that is not the freedom of one who never fell, but the freedom of one who fell and was lifted back up, the freedom of the prodigal son who came to his father with his speech prepared and never got to deliver it, because the father had already run out to meet him long before he finished formulating his repentance. This image of the father running out to meet his child is central to Teresa's understanding of divine mercy. She returned to it at different moments in her writings because in it she found the most direct answer to the question that most paralyzes the soul that has sinned. Will the forgiveness arrive before I have finished repenting enough? The answer Teresa drew from that image is the same the Church places at the center of divine mercy. Sunday, the Father does not wait at the end of the road. The Father goes out. The forgiveness moves toward the soul before the soul has finished taking all its steps. The mercy of God is not reactive, it is initiative. God does not respond to repentance. God provokes repentance because He has already decided to forgive. This has an implication Saint Teresa of Jesus considered fundamental, and it is what makes Divine Mercy Sunday something qualitatively different from any other day of the liturgical year. On that Sunday, God's initiative intensifies in a way the Church recognizes and guarantees. It is not that on other days God is unwilling to forgive. It is that on that Sunday, God opens the floodgates of His mercy to a width that has no equivalent at any other moment in the calendar. And the soul that arrives on that day with trust is not seizing an opportunity among many. It is walking through the widest door heaven opens all year. Saint Teresa of Jesus saw this in prayer on more than one occasion. She described it with different images at different moments in her writings, but all the images pointed in the same direction. The mercy of God is greater than the soul can imagine, greater than the soul's history, greater than the soul's sins, greater than the soul's fear of approaching, greater than the soul's doubt about whether it deserves what God is offering. And on Divine Mercy Sunday, that greatness is poured out over the world with a generosity the Church's tradition has struggled to capture in words, except by saying this: on that day, for the soul that trusts, God gives everything. What Jesus fulfills on that Sunday is His own word. He fulfills the promise He has always made, and that on this day becomes tangible, sacramental, objective reality for the soul that comes to Him. He fulfills complete forgiveness. He fulfills complete freedom. He fulfills the unrestricted reconciliation between the soul and God that sin had interrupted, and that divine mercy restores all the way back to the starting point, back to baptism, back to the instant when nothing separated the soul from God and everything between them was possible. Saint Teresa of Jesus received that fulfillment. She received it when she was a divided woman who could not quite make up her mind, who loved God and at the same time remained bound to what she knew was not God. She received it when her soul was, in her own words, a mixture of sincere desire and constant weakness. And what she received then was so complete, so overwhelming, so far beyond what she could have merited or anticipated, that she spent the rest of her life trying to convince every soul she encountered that that same fulfillment was available to them, that the promise had no exceptions, that Divine Mercy Sunday was not a day for the perfect, but for the needy, that Jesus did not promise to fulfill that promise for those who no longer needed it, but for those who need it so deeply that sometimes they don't even dare to ask. And you need it, and that Sunday is coming. And the promise has your name. You have made it this far. You have listened to everything, and if you have listened with that part of the soul that does not argue, but simply receives, something has already changed in you before that Sunday ever arrives. Because truth does not act only when it is applied. It acts from the moment it is received. And what you have received today is not information about the mercy of God. It is the mercy of God explained from the inside, from within a soul that lived it all the way to the depths and left written what she saw, so that no other soul would ever have to arrive at that Sunday without knowing what it holds. You now know what the promise is. You know it is not a feeling or an emotional experience that depends on the mood of the day. It is an objective reality guaranteed by the Church that acts upon the soul independently of what the soul happens to feel in that moment. You know the promise has conditions, and you know which condition matters most, the one no prayer can replace, the one Saint Teresa of Jesus identified after years of lived experience as the only one God truly requires. Trust. Not the trust that is felt, but the trust that is decided. The trust that says yes to God's love even when the soul's history says it has no right to. You know that the obstacles standing between the soul and the promise do not come from sin, but from misdirected devotion, from scrupulosity that spins in circles, from self-sufficiency that confuses preparation with merit, from a lukewarmness that has made its peace with the distance and stopped feeling it as distance. You know that Saint Teresa of Jesus passed through every one of those obstacles from the inside, and that the way out she found was not greater effort but deeper surrender, a letting go into the love that was already there, waiting with a patience that has no bottom, and a generosity that surpasses everything reason can anticipate. You know what happens when the promise is fulfilled, that it is not always felt but is always real, that the soul is set free with a freedom that belongs not to those who never fell, but to those who fell and were lifted back up, that Jesus does not wait at the end of the road but comes out to meet us, that the mercy of God is not reactive but initiative, that forgiveness arrives before the soul has finished formulating its repentance, because God decided to forgive long before the soul decided to return. And you know, above all, that the promise has your name, not the name of the perfect, not the name of those who have walked for decades without stumbling in any significant way. Your name, the name of a soul that has lived, that has chosen well and chosen badly, that loves God and at the same time knows with precision the moments it chose something else. For that soul the promise was made. For you, divine mercy, Sunday exists. For you the Father came running while you were still far down the road home. Staying until the end was the best decision you made today. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who knew the value of every moment in which the soul chooses to listen to the voice of God rather than to the noise of the world, would have told you exactly that. The minutes a soul spends coming to know the mercy of God more deeply are never wasted. They always return. They always produce something, even when the soul cannot see it in the moment it is making that investment. There is something I want to ask of you before you finish listening. Something small and concrete, something directly tied to what you have just received. Because the soul that receives a truth has a decision before it, to let it pass through or to let it enter. And the simplest way to let it enter, the way Saint Teresa of Jesus recommended to her sisters when they had received something important in prayer, is to speak it aloud, to say it, to let it travel from the understanding to the heart by way of a word spoken out loud or written by hand. So I want you to do something right now. Write in the comments of this video a single phrase, not a summary of what you learned, not a long reflection. One single phrase, a declaration of faith addressed directly to Jesus on this Divine Mercy Sunday. Write this: Jesus, I trust in your mercy. Write it now. Write it as the act of faith that it is, because those words are not merely words. They are the posture of the soul that has decided to surrender to God's love rather than go on calculating whether it deserves to receive it. They are trust-made gesture. They are the soul opening its hands. And when you write it, you will see that you are not alone, that there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of souls who have heard what you heard today and who are writing the same words from different places, different countries, different histories, and that all those words together form something that rises. The prayer of many souls, trusting simultaneously in the mercy of God, carries a weight no solitary prayer carries. And Saint Teresa of Jesus, who founded her convents precisely so that many souls could pray together with the same intention, would have understood perfectly what happens when thousands of souls write at the same moment the same words of trust in the God who promised to fulfill his promise on that Sunday. Write it. Jesus, I trust in your mercy, now. And now comes the other thing I want to ask of you, and I ask it with the same urgency with which Saint Teresa of Jesus urged her daughters never to let a grace slip by when the Lord placed it before them. This channel exists so that the soul that seeks God with seriousness can find something more than surface-level devotion. It exists so that the spirituality of Saint Teresa of Jesus, one of the deepest and most complete the Church has produced in 20 centuries of history, can reach people like you, people who know that faith is not an ornament of life, but its very center. That prayer is not one habit among many, but the heartbeat that keeps everything else alive. Every week we publish a new video. Every week there is something Saint Teresa of Jesus wrote that needs to be heard today, in this century, by souls living in this world, carrying the same fears and the same longings as souls of every other century. Subscribe to this channel right now. Press the subscribe button. It is a small gesture with large consequences, because every video we publish is an opportunity to receive something the soul needs and may not have known it needed until it heard it. Do not let the next video find you without a subscription. Do not let something that was set aside for you arrive and find you not there to receive it. Subscribe now. Before you go, I want to leave you with something. With an image Saint Teresa of Jesus used in the book of her life to describe what happens in the soul when it finally stops resisting and surrenders to the mercy of God without conditions. She said it was like stepping out of a dark room into full sunlight, that the soul which has spent a long time living in the darkness of its own distrust, when it finally opens the door and lets the light in, does not need to exert itself in order to see. The light does the work on its own. The soul only needs to have opened the door. The Sunday that is coming is the door. The mercy of God is the light, and you already know what you need to do. May the Lord go with you on that journey. May the intercession of Saint Teresa of Jesus hold you steady when trust begins to waver. May you arrive at divine mercy Sunday with an open heart, with hands empty of merit and full of faith, with the certainty that what Jesus promised to fulfill on that day, he fulfills in truth, completely, in the soul that trusts in him without conditions. Until the next video, may God keep you, and may Saint Teresa of Jesus take you gently by the hand.